George Flentke is the former chapter manager, transitioning chapter manager of the Wisconsin chapter. He has a Ph.D. in pharmacology, biochemistry, pharmacology, and he will be talking to us about drugs. Thanks, George.
Okay, first and foremost, I'm a wanderer. Live with it. Second point is I'm listening to all of what your people are saying through an incredible collection of hisses, pops, and tonalities that is only in my head. I listen to voices. So if you've got questions, I probably won't hear them directly. She will, and then we'll work on it. So you can ask questions, but it's a little bit more complicated of a process for me. It says it's on. Okay, hold on. Let's try that. Awesome. Positions are important. I want to start off with the first situation that we have to deal with here. I'm giving you 3 numbers, 0, 2, and 9. How many drugs have been approved for rabbits by the FDA? 0, 2, 9. Raise your hand. 0. 2. Somebody's reading my hand. 9. None. It's 2. Both of which are medicated feeds. You cannot put drugs into a feed without an FDA approval. They're both coccidiostats for baby bunnies. So that's not a lot, and it's not terribly useful. The second thing that you got to realize that comes out of that is something that I want everybody here to understand. You're all educators. You need to understand the process. This means that every vet is using drugs off-label. What does that mean for the vet? That means that he's doing an ethical statement that I think this is going to do a good job, but he's also making a full legal liability on which drug he's choosing and how much. Okay? That means almost everything that we're dealing with rabbit drugs is somewhat anecdotal. It's very well, and they work at it. This means that the drug dosages, are something that they have to think about and work at all the time, and that means that those doses change all the time. So Medicham started off really low, and it's increased almost 4-fold in the last couple of years, and this is because somewhere out the way, you've got to remember, they're not dogs. I love dogs. Dogs are great. They eat anything, and their mechanism of toxicology is to throw it up. Unfortunately, when it comes to COX inhibitors, this is a great way to sit back here and get in trouble, so they get gut issues and they throw it up. So what you need for a dog and what you need for a rabbit are different. But this goes for almost anything that you're working with rabbits. So give your vet some serious limit of that. When I started with rabbits, the vets were saying, oh no, you can't give more than 2 mg per kilogram of Baytril. Anything more will kill the animal. Well, now we're up to about 10, 15, sometimes 20. And so you're really, it's a variable. That's why I'm not going to be big on handing you out numbers. They change. Your vet's going to be much more up to date by going to meetings and things of that nature to get what people are using collectively as best they can. But remember, this is an ongoing evolutionary process, so the numbers change all the time. Rabbit Therapeutics, good, bad, and the ugly. I love the title, but this is the situation. How a drug works for you depends entirely upon a whole bunch of features. There's no such thing as a truly bad drug. Sometimes they get used in different ways and are effective. Sometimes you can't use them at all. Sometimes they're just basically no problems whatsoever. Very rare. Rabbit pharmacology is based on a bunch of things. The most important thing is the rabbit itself. The rabbits are herbivores. We just had a lot of that, and we all know it. They're hindgut fermenters. You just heard a whole talk on them. So this is going to make things fast. They're prey animals, which means they hide their symptoms. It also means they hide their side effects to drugs. Response to infection is really different. How many people have had to deal with rabbit pus? There we go. My best description of rabbit pus is day-old toothpaste on the counter. It's thick. It don't move. It's a very different response. They wall off infections. These are big issues when it comes to how it's... Very different way. They wall off infections. This is all part of how you have to deal with some of these things. Other general idiosyncrasies, they've got all kinds. My favorite is the fact that most of these rabbits can't use atropine on them. It's a species that's completely wiped out. They have no lysozyme. Makes a difference. It's part of why they don't process pus the same way.
Click the mouse once.
Drugs we're talking about today are going to be antibiotics. Gut motility drugs are the silver bullet of the rabbit world in some respects. Antiparasiticals, some bits on anesthetics and some bits on analgesia. So, when you're looking at dealing with drug therapy in rabbits, you've got to think of a variety of things. Not only does it have to be the right drug, it has to have what we call bioavailability. If I swallow it, how much actually gets into the bloodstream? You've got to have what we call pharmacodynamics. No, drugs are sometimes not touched. They go in your system, they leave it in exactly the same state. It's not changed. Other times, the drug is chemically changed. Case in point, Cipro and enterofloxacin are the same drug after being biomodified. No difference. Excretion. This is terribly important. We'll get into that with a lot of the antibiotics. Where it gets excreted is what makes it a good drug for rabbit or a bad drug for rabbit. Therapeutic index is a statement I use with lay people. It has no real meaning. But what it is telling you a little bit is something about what we expect is how this drug is, quote, safe. In other words, there's a drug action that works at a concentration, and then we start getting side effect issues, okay? Barbiturates are very bad with a lot of rabbits for anesthesia because the side effects happen very quickly. So they'd have a therapeutic index of about 1 to 2, so to speak, because they start having respiratory problems right away. My favorite one on the list on the other end of it is something called Droncit. We use that for tapeworms. It has a therapeutic index between where you have good drug action and toxicology is somewhere over 1,000. Good thing to know. Model animals. Well, I love this part. The last one. You just listen to Micah. There aren't a lot. Horses are the most common things that get FDA-approved drugs that are remotely close to rabbits. They're not the same kind of high nut fermenter, but it's still something to look at. It's where you start looking to see on basic levels on whether or not something can happen. And again, it's a lot more FDA-approved systems in horses than there are cats and dogs. Obligate carnivores to strange omnivores don't usually give you a perfect example of some of the problems you've got. Everything is a model system, but some are better than others. As we were talking here, this is what we call the crux of the matter. Not including the stomach, the GI, the cecum is 60% of the volume of the tract. The small intestine is much smaller for the animal than it is. For bioavailability, if it's got to be absorbed by a small intestine, it's going to change the bioavailability. So a drug that would be good in a cat, or a dog that has a longer small intestine than a rabbit does, it's going to change that. It means less drug is going to get into the system. All part of the problems when we're dealing with rabbits. That cecum, that's our big bugaboo when it comes to antibiotics for the most part. It's huge. It's full of bacteria. Again, I love that other talk. We don't have to talk about it. Major players are Bacteroides. There is some Clostridium and some E. coli in there. Clostridium is in there in very small quantities, and it doesn't like the pH. Therefore, it's not a big portion of it. We've got a whole pile of other ones that we've labeled in there. We've got, like you said, fungi, bacteria, various protozoans, all kinds of stuff. The problem with that thing is, and I still say it this way, this is a small ecology. Messing with it in one way, changing parts of it, can have big effects. We keep the Bacteroides on the top because it's the major player there. And it's the one that gets us into a lot of trouble when we get dysbiosis by antibiotics. So we keep that one in mind. But there is a ton of what's going on in there. And the infection and the drug choice is critical. So you're going to see this on so many slides. Culture and sensitivity. The more you know about what you're trying to fight and what antibiotics you can use for it, the better off you are. Targeting is important. You upset the gut, you end up with enterotoxemia. What usually happens is the scenario is that the Bacteroides gets killed off. Bacteroides likes acid conditions. By acid conditions, I'm talking 3-4. What happens when the bacteria gets kicked off is it goes up to 6-7. Clostridium loves pH 6-7, which is more neutral. Once you get into those levels, you get into other issues. Clostridium is just naturally resistant to most antibiotics. It's a troublemaker. Clostridium gives us botulism toxin. That's one toxin. What we worry about in rabbits is probably iodotoxin and some other ones. Once that toxin's kicked in, that's where we get the physiological effects of enterotoxemia. What you end up with those is, and the other thing to point out is it's made worse by simple carbohydrates. Clostridium, when it gets a load of glucose, immediately starts deciding to make a lot more iodotoxin. That's what they do. What you end up with is diarrhea, may or may not be bloody, anorectic, depressed, hypothermic. You get sepsis, you get hemorrhaging, you get death. We won't want to be there. Baby bunnies are different. Baby bunnies have a completely different set of gut bacteria. It's got a higher pH. It's going to be more what I call omnivore-like. It has a bigger component of E. coli or coliforms. And that's just the nature. It's getting milk instead of having to deal with hay and such for its gut before it turns over. Coccidia is the #1 killer of baby bunnies, which is why there's only 2 drugs out there, and they're both for coccidia. Meet the microbiome. This is something that you're going to start seeing important in the next 5 or 10 years. They walked with my water. That's no fun. What you've got with the microbiome, this is a little bit about what Micah was talking about also. And it's important for us because we're talking about it in rabbits for the last 20 years. In the last 5 or 6 years, they're talking about this for everything. Your gut bacteria in this room is all over the place. We have a whole series of microbiomes in this room. They will alter, they will alter your ability to deal with obesity. They are important for diabetes. They change your glucotolerance, and we're only beginning to figure this out. And as a result, Big Pharma now has to pay attention to microbiomes. They're going to start having to think about things like rabbits to some degree, but they have to pay attention to that now too. It's going to change how antibiotics get dealt with in the next 20 years. My favorite one right now is Tyser's disease. Tyser's disease in rabbits is a specific clostridial infection. Guess what? It's one of the biggest secondary bacterial infections in human hospital-derived infections. It's not the first one. The first one, they sit back here with antibiotics, screw up the microbiome of the human, and end up with a pile of Clostridium in the gut. And over the next 1 month to several years, people keep on coming back with bloody diarrhea issues. It's the same Clostridium that causes Tyser's disease. We now have 2 drugs for Tyser's disease that are in phase 2 and phase 3 clinical trials. I'm very interested in those drugs. They're starting to think about the microbiome issues. The problem with those 2 drugs is that I keep on sitting back here and bugging the manufacturers, and they can't tell me if Bacteroides is sensitive to it or not. I always keep an eye open on these things, because this is where we will find new drugs for rabbits if we can sit back here and make them work. But I want to point this one out because it's my favorite piece of humor. The FDA doesn't approve these, but there are trials out basically feeding, let's call it reprocessed human feces back to people to deal with Tyser's disease. It works very well. Trust me, the FDA does not think that feeding feces to people is an acceptable thing. But it turns around and shows you the microbiome issue. If we can straighten out the human microbiome this way, it's why we've been feeding sequels to bunnies for years. It's finally catching up to human medicine. Antibiotics, the good, the bad, and the ugly. Culture and sensitivity is critical. You really want to know as best you can what you've got and what it's sensitive to. The problem we've always got with antibiotics is something the drug industry loves. They love these broad spectrum choices, you know. It's a little bit of the Dominican Inquisition. Kill them all and let God sort them out. This is not appropriate, and it will become less appropriate over the next, hopefully, 10 or 20 years. Because bacterial genocide gets us into trouble with rabbits, and it obviously is starting to show that we've been doing it way too easily on people, and it's not a good idea. So we'll hopefully see some changes in that. Man didn't invent antibiotics. Antibiotics came from dirt. In fact, they almost are all Actomyces species. Even the more synthetic ones started their life off as a natural antibiotic, which the pharmaceutical industry monkeyed with until they came up with something better or easier to work with or absorb better, all kinds of different reasons. So dirt is our friend and foe. We're back to another microbiome here. The things that are providing us with antibiotics also provided us with antibiotics resistance. It all came from the same source. Dirt is the world's most massive chemical warfare game. They're producing antibiotics to survive. Somebody else is producing something to wipe out the antibiotics. So the ecology of dirt is great. And the techniques we're using for microbiome will hopefully pick out new antibiotics out of dirt that we couldn't do it before. The same things that Micah were talking about, it's the same ones here. You got to be able to grow them up. This is a tricky one. You have to find the right environment. So while the rabbit gut has got a whole bunch of things in it that we would love to be able to figure out what they are, we don't have a way of growing them up, so we have to come up with ways that don't require us to actually culture them. Same thing here. We want genocide, not suicide. We want those drugs to sit back here and work well for us without killing us. There's a lot of antibiotics out there that have never made it to market because they basically are really good at killing mammals. And not particularly in a wonderful fashion. So we don't know no longer do we want to have all the bugs dead, but we really want to keep what we're dealing with antibiotics appropriate so that a single antibiotic will sit back here and treat something that we want it to treat and not everything. It's important to note with antibiotics, 85% of the antibiotics manufactured in this country go into feed. That is why we have a drug resistance problem to some degree. But it also gives you an idea where Big Pharma's money is. You have to keep this in mind. There's nothing we can do about it. It's important to recognize what's going on. For us, Baytril and Vancomycin almost got screwed up by the chicken industry. Okay? Luckily, Vancomycin is literally the last antibiotic that could be used in many multi-drug resistance, and they pulled it out of the chicken industry. I want to thank the moron that sat back here and sent anthrax to the Senate. Realize that WHO has only one treatment antibiotic for anthrax. It's Cipro. All of a sudden, it was already in the works to get Baytril out of chickens. But the fact of the matter is, once we sat back here, it ended up being dealing with the only thing that you're supposed to be able to treat anthrax with. That just dropped it in about 2 weeks. It was wonderful. Again, we want antibiotics to basically do well for us and our own microbiota. This is not the easy task. So, the antibiotics kill by sitting back here and choosing things that basically bacteria have and we don't. We don't have cell walls. They do. Our way of making DNA is slightly different than what's in bacteria. Our way of dealing with cell protein synthesis is a little different, and those are the things that we target. With cell walls, we don't have them. One cell wall is gram-positive, 2 cell walls is gram-negative, and that's 100 years ago. That's where they came up with those things, and we're still using them now. most of the antibiotics that we got to date are interfering with that cell wall creation. The largest class of it is most of these. This is the penicillin, the cephalosporins, and the like. And it's also azithromycin, which works great in rabbits. These things have little selectivity. Big Pharma had discovered a long time ago that if we do these kind of things, we can really work at making them more and more effective, more and more anaerobic, insensitive. And so this particular series of bacteria, antibiotics, really went to Big Pharma's tendencies to sit back here and go for broad-spectrum drugs, which is something that is bad for herbivores. Like I said, penicillin and cephalosporins are big ones. Bacteroides are sensitive, which is always a bad thing, and Clostridium are not. So the beta-lactams, big group of beta-lactams, mostly penicillins and sporins. Now, this is where I'm going to start getting specific. Penicillin G, what are we looking for in a drug for rabbit? Urinary excretion is very good. It means it's not getting thrown back into the GI tract. Bad, rabbits, and this is a real number. This is in rabbits. Penicillin G is only 40 to 60% bioavailable in rabbits. Most of it stays put in the gut. So if we're choosing something that's basically going to be a systemic full dose on an animal of 25 micrograms per mil of body volume, we're going to sit back here and remembering all of the numbers to go through it. We say it's 40% bioavailable, and it goes into ends up in the cecum straight out of the gut with the rest of it. We end up with 375 micrograms per mil in the cecum. This is kind of like tossing a grenade into a small room. Also, at those concentrations, even resistant bacteria can get shifted over to being less resistant because you toss so much antibiotic in there. And this is where we get into trouble with the cecum. So, to be good, we're looking for penicillin G to go from an ugly bacteria, an ugly antibiotic to a good one. We're going and saying, no oral penicillin G. It's just too troublesome. There's no way of making it work. So you're talking injection. It does have good kidney excretion. It doesn't get transported back into the gut to speak of. So injection's a good way to go. The second thing to recognize to make things good is to realize there are different ways. Formulation is a big issue. And with penicillin G, we basically make it insoluble. When you're getting those various forms of penicillin G, it's a white mess. That white mess is precipitated penicillin. We precipitate it with procaine, we precipitate it with benzothiazine, or both. Depending on what you precipitate it with, depends upon how long it takes to get back into circulation. So procaine takes less time because it's slightly more soluble. Benzothiazine takes longer. So essentially, you can get a longer amount of penicillin G into the bloodstream that way. And that's, like I said, how we turn a bad antibiotic or a troublesome one into something functional. It works out fairly well, and as a result, we see this. The interesting thing about this is that even still, we get this kind of interesting cycle with veterinary practice. Oral penicillin was bad. We don't start using any of the controlled releases for a while because people are so nervous about it. Now we're starting to see them used more. We'll see how it goes. So it's not like I get phone calls, my vet injected my rabbit with penicillin, it's going to die. I read it on the internet. Probably not. Second generation, third generation beta-lactams and cephalosporins. This is where the drug industry had a great time. These are much more, anaerobes are much more sensitive to these. They're much more deadly for those. Their bioavailability is all over the board. You cannot do an oral drug on these. Most of the time, because we don't actually have good data on exactly in rabbits how much of the drug is actually crossing in the small intestine. The real issue for most of these, though, is that they've changed their excretion form. While you had the penicillin Gs were all being gone out the urine, which meant they bypassed everything, what happens to these is it's a molecular weight filter. It's hit a certain size of a drug. That size means that it gets picked up by the liver and sent out the bile duct as its mechanism of excretion. The bile duct is right back into the intestine. This means that the drug is going back to the cecum. This is where these things get into serious trouble, because all of these drugs are now, even if you gave them as an injection, they're getting into the small intestine and going straight into the cecum. That makes them just, they're ugly. Chloramphenicol is one of my favorites. This drug should be a real wasted effort. It's used in people, third tier, for bacteroides infection. It's third tier because in people, not in animals, 1 in 43,000 people will get anaplastic anemia, which basically says, I'm going to wipe out the stem cell, the bottom cell, that's making all your red blood cells, all your white blood cells, and your platelets, which control your clotting. So 1 in 43,000 people die using this drug. No good way of dealing with it. It is used for bacteroides, which means that we shouldn't be touching this in rabbits. Again, it's formulation and knowing what you got. With rabbits, it's urinary excretion exclusively from chloramphenicol. The bioavailability is almost 99% in rabbits. It goes straight from the small intestine into the bloodstream, and it's not it doesn't go through anything else but urinary excretion. That's why a lot of people might be using it for urinary tract infection. The issue with this drug, though, is that sometimes, most of the time, it's what we call bacteriostatic. It doesn't actually kill the bacteria, it just stops it. If you've got a bladder infection, that means you can basically wash it out. But it's not a great drug. Again, the beauty of this one is that there's not a lot of drug resistance because it's not used in agricultural uses, because 1 in 43,000 people can be killed by it. So it's not seen in agricultural use at all. It's banned. Drug industry would really like that market back. So they have basically done just about everything to chloramphenicol to try to make it to something functional. The last one was called fluoroquinolones. They changed the one moiety on the drug for another. And all I can say is that there was a herd of rabbits in France that they gave this drug to, and they wiped the herd out. Okay? What had happened is that in most species, chlorampphenicol's bioavailability is not that good. So instead of sitting back here and having the beautiful bioavailability that chloramphenicol has, it dropped. So the amount of antibiotics still in the small intestine after it passed through was massively increased. This is where something basically had gone wrong. Stick with chloramphenicol. It tastes terrible. The ones that we've been used to, the ones that have been great for rabbits over the years, has been the various fluoroquinolones. You know these as Cipro or ciprofloxacin. You know this is Baytril. You know this is Orbax. You know this is the now late lamented Diturol, along with a bunch of other ones that are in human pharmacopoeias. These work well because they're aerobic specific. They don't hit anaerobes very well. And so bacteroides is fairly safe no matter how poor its bioavailability is. Bacteroides is insensitive, it's orally effective, it really does have good bioavailability. All issue with all animals is that in growing animals you might have cartilage damage. I want to point out how that study was done, because it's an important thing on how a lot of that medicine is dealt with. The cartilage damage was done on 25 beagles. That's not a lot of animals, okay? But that was where it was done. There's always, when working with veterinary medicine, the number of clinical trials in people are thousands and thousands. You get good side effect data off of that. But when you're working in a lot of evaluations with vets, the animals are smaller. So the veterinary practice is where most of the side effects get found. Drug industry, this one's tricky. The drug industry has seriously been trying to make fluoroquinolones broad spectrum. They have not succeeded yet. I give them credit. They're very good at it. So we have to worry about that. We've got drug resistance all the time. And one of the reasons why getting Baytril out from underneath the chicken industry is the type of drug resistance that happens with Baytril is the worst kind. It's called somatic. It means that it's changing the basic DNA of the species. Once that's done, it doesn't go back. Almost all of the antibiotic resistance that is found in things like penicillin is called plasmid-based resistance. You can actually get that to ebb and flow in a population, so that a population eventually could become penicillin sensitive again if you do appropriate antibiotic treatment and keep things, shall we say, controlled using the antibiotics correctly. You can't do that with a resistant bug that has now got bacteroides resistance. It's permanent. It's a very difficult situation. It's why we wanted to get it out of the chicken industry. Tetracyclines is a great thing. It's where we got it right. This is one of my favorites because tetracycline was on the pharmacopoeia for rabbits for years, and yet there were so many papers out there that showed it was completely ineffective. This is a completely oral. Its oral bioavailability is 0. Rabbits, with all the calcium in their system and their inability to empty their gut, means that when you get tetracycline for you, it says take it on an empty stomach, don't drink with milk. Okay? The calcium immediately inactivates it, so it's impossible to take this as an oral drug. Doxycycline, on the other hand, with a simple modification of this, is calcium insensitive, and it works just fine. Sulfa drugs work well. They're orally useful. They're potentiated, which means that there's actually 2 drugs in there at the same time that really make a fantastic antibiotic. Sulfasalazine is a derivative that's sometimes used in rabbits. It's a combination of a sulfa drug and a painkiller. Aminoglycosides have been an offshoot that's used in rabbits. I think most of the time nowadays it's being used in nebulization, which makes sense. It's not orally available. It requires an injection. It has all kinds of different issues to it. It's toxic to kidneys depending upon how much is given. It can cause deafness, not so much in the types that we see today, but it's still a problem. And for years people kept on saying, oh, this is synergistic with other antibiotics. And I think at this point in time, this is a dead issue. It doesn't seem to be stronger with other antibiotics. So sometimes in the rabbit literature they keep on pushing this, but it never exists. Azithromycin. This is another drug that shouldn't be great. It gets us into the same issues as some of the Penicillin Gs, but it's binding a different protein. It's operating differently than Penicillin G, but it's still damaging cell walls. It's been a safe macrocyclid, unlike most of the macrocyclids. It was originally combined with another antibiotic and being used, but it's used singly for a lot of times for people for upper respiratory infections and other things as the culture and sensitivity dictate. It's orally useful because it's essentially got good bioavailability, but you're going to find it's got one problem. Its shelf life is really terrible. The human drug is only good for about a week and a half in the refrigerator. It's not cheap. I'm not sitting back here promoting Roadrunner Pharmacy, but they make a very good shelf-stable azithromycin formulation for pets that, like I said, it's shelf-stable, room temperature for months. So if you're really working with this one a lot, they've got a good formulation for you. They're really ugly. These are Clindamycin, Vancomycin, erythromycin. These are actually used to experimentally induce enterotoxemia in rabbits. You wouldn't think there'd ever be a good use for these things, but they do use them. They use them in antibiotic beads. Antibiotic beads for abscesses is a technique where they actually take the antibiotic, they put it in a small bead and directly insert it into the abscess. Why is that good? Well, if you're dealing with, it's the opposite of what I was talking about with the cecum. I'm taking a very concentrated amount of antibiotic and putting exactly where it needs to be. As it dilutes out and gets out of the system, the amount that gets diluted out gets to a point where it is not effective for damaging the bacteroides, which is what's happening with these drugs in the cecum because its concentration is too low. So we're just basically playing the opposite game. It just gets diluted out in the system. So if you're working with a vet that likes to use antibiotic beads and abscesses, you might be using some of these. You might be using Chloramphenicol. You might be using some of the other ones. Vancomycin has cardiac toxicity. I know a couple of vets that used to use this with a release statement. Others just refused. It's bad on your business when you give a rabbit a shot. 20 minutes later, it screams as it goes out the door and dies right in the waiting room. It's a problem. This is an example where the research articles in the literature weren't any good. Those articles were, again, typical of a veterinary drug study. 10 rabbits, 4 to 6 months old, New Zealand white males. Nice population. Doesn't speak a lot for our 5 to 6 or elder buns, which is where things were starting to get tricky. They had no problem with, again, 10 rabbits is not good statistics. And as they hit the vet market and they started using them in other ways is when the cardiotoxicity showed up. I'm not happy with the drug that has a 1-800 number in case there's a human stick. Okay. This is not a fun drug. Abscess therapeutics, again, they lack lysozyme as one of the reasons why that pus is so darn thick and gooey. And because that pus is so thick, darn, and gooey, you end up with all kinds of different ways of trying to treat it. There is no good antibiotics that basically can penetrate that kind of slimy mess. It's just the nature of it. CNS, if you're looking at abscesses, CNS is important. One of the things about CNS on abscesses is it really should have an anaerobic component because that's probably what's growing in those abscesses. Treatment is almost always some kind of debriding and either bacteriostatic packing, the antibiotic beads that I was talking about before, some systemic antibiotic, or open drainage. The funny thing I got is I think the vets are doing a great job because these aren't showing up as being the big issue they used to be. The combinations of therapies out there and understanding how to deal with it has made them much more treatable than we used to have. Antibiotic beads usually use bone cement, PMMA, which is a methyl acrylate. And again, this is where you can use a drug that would normally be an absolute failure, like Clindamycin, effectively. Chloramphenicol can be used. Aminoglycosides are used, beta-lactams sometimes. The biggest problem with these is they all have to be formulated by the vet. Usually you cannot get a pharmacy formulator to do the job for you. So if your vet wants to do it, he's the one that has to do it. The second thing is sterilizing these things are non-trivial. They have to be chemically sterilized with ethylene oxide. You can't use a standard heat autoclave. Antibiotic resistance. As I said before, there's two kinds. Baytril has got antibiotic resistance. It's called somatic. It's right in the chromosome of the bacterial DNA. Once you've got it forever. It doesn't get lost. The other one, plasmid-derived, is in a shall we say, a micro piece of DNA that's in the bacteria. You can lose that. You can get it back. One of the reasons why it's usually kept low is it takes a lot of energy to keep that gene on that separate piece of DNA. So a lot of bacteria will basically lose that over time because it's extra energy. Its bacterial friend next door doesn't have it. It's growing faster, so it can evolutionarily be lost. So this is one of the reasons why good antibiotic, shall we say, use in hospitals and things like that can make an antibiotic useful again, but it cannot do it on a somatic mutation. So I'm glad that Baytril is out of the chicken industry. Again, we want to, with all antibiotics, you want to use them when necessary, you want to know which one you want to use, and you really want to choose the right one. Silver bullets. Gut motility drugs have been one of those situations that a lot of people have found to be very useful in rabbits. It gets you out of the gut stasis problem that shows up in the vet office so much of the time, and you're always asking, okay, I got gut stasis, I have another problem, but the first one I got to deal with is the gut stasis. So it's been a very useful drug. Cisapride is one of them. Oh, by the way, thank the human industry for sitting back here and overuse of opioids. We have these drugs because of burn patients and cancer patients. They are on heavy amounts of morphine. Morphine and a lot of the other opioids, the earlier ones, have constipation problems like you wouldn't believe. These drugs were designed to basically be given in conjunction with those morphine opioid type drugs in order to get those people to basically be able to have a somewhat standard GI tract again. So cisapride is one version of this. It basically seems to be in most species to be more of a full gut activity with gut motility. The problem with it was it started to run into cardiac arrhythmias in people associated with erythromycin and several other drugs that blocked one of the systems that drugs use to change the drug and excrete it. And as a result, cisapride's a little bit more hard to get a hold of. It's almost always in a hospital situation. It's available, it's just a little bit more work. Metoclopramide or Reglan is the other big one in the field. This is more of a stomach, small intestine motility. It does cause hyperexcitability that seems to be anecdotal and everything, but I've seen it happen too much in too many species, so it seems to be there if you really give a lot of it. They can be used together. Sometimes they use them with an acid blocker like cimetidine. It's contraindicated, of course, in true blockage cases. If you've got a true blockage and you use one of these drugs, you're stressing the gut system. You could cause a rupture. So you really need to make sure that it's used correctly. And of course, you need pain meds and gas meds if you're really working with gut stasis. This is a combination of stuff. One of the things that happened early on with this was people would sometimes get diarrhea in gut stasis, so they'd give Imodium D. Imodium D is contraindicated in these situations. Imodium D is a zero bioavailable opioid. It doesn't leave the gut, it doesn't give you any analgesic effects, but it gives you all the constipation effects you want. So it wasn't a good idea. It came and went very quickly in the vet world. Antiparasitics, I love these. They almost all work well. You get a variety of different ones out there. You get ivermectin, its derivatives, selectamin, which is used in some of the anti-flea behind the neck things. All work pretty good. Imidaclopramide is a fun one for me because I'm a drug freak, and that particular one sits back here and does what we try to do with drugs. We try to pick something that mammals don't have. Well, insects have chitin. That's the exoskeleton. That blocks chitin production. So much for that. Good on fleas. ThroMycin, it's just one of the anti-tapeworm drugs. Sulfa drugs work well. Marquise, Bacox, those type of things all work well. The one I always point out to people is Frontline. Frontline is a topical organophosphate compound or organophosphate school, and it seems to have more problems with rabbits than not. It's essentially an insecticide you're spraying on rabbit or doing on the spot, and this is the one that basically shows up regularly as having problems with toxicity. Our local shelter was spaying and neutering rabbits, giving everybody a dose of Frontline all in a while, and all of a sudden they had piles of sick rabbits, and they thought that their new vet really was having problems with the spay and neuters, and it really turned out it was like, well, drop the Frontline, and that was the end of most of the problems. Frontline was just an extra stress on the system. Anesthesics. These are, again, one of the good, bad, and the ugly things. If there was something that slowed down rabbit surgery results for years, it was the fact that barbiturates was the first thing they used. Rabbits go into apnea or basically stop having their breathing.
I have a question about antiparasite drugs. Your thoughts on Capstar or the one in treatment for family studies?
What was the name of the drug again?
Capstar.
Yeah, what about it?
Yeah, just what your thoughts were.
It works fine. And if we're on the subject of this, Advantage and Revolution are there. Advantage has now gone into several different morphs, and all of them are safe on rabbits as far as I've been able to determine. The drugs that they've added to them aren't obvious problems with rabbits. My personal experience with most of them have been pretty good. So while that's the other problem with fun things with pharmaceuticals is they tinker a lot. So you end up going, okay, that was good. Is the new one any better or worse?
Just on the anti-parasite question, the Marquis and the Bacox, we've gone online on this a little bit. I don't know if anybody has yet figured out what the deal is between the Marquis, which is the sulfone drug, and then the Bacox is sulfate. But in Europe, they're using Baycox at 2 to 5 mg per kg, and here I'm hearing vets using 20, an order of magnitude, 20 to 50 mg per kg of the Panazeral, and that some people are mixing them up, and there could be bad side effects, that the Baycox has more potential bad side effects than the Panazeral. I mean, than the sulfone, the Panazeral sulfone. Do we know any more about that?
Not really.
Okay.
I mean, when it comes to side effects, if you're lucky and somebody has managed to, shall we say, solve it out, it's usually in another species. And I don't have any information on what's going on with that one at all. There was another question.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I saw that thread too, and I thought somebody had said that people were getting confused with the dosages, with the Marquis being 2.5 to 5 and
That was
Baycox being 25 to 50, or vice versa.
Yes, and I want to point out to people that you're sitting back here, and you should be sitting back here. And this is a comment that you can all humble me later on. A lot of these drugs were essentially being dosed outside of the veterinarian's office, and so you're losing the ability of getting that one beautiful filter, the person who should be knowing how to deal with the drug. That's one of the reasons why I'm not getting a lot of therapeutic values here. Really, go to your vet and go with this system, particularly when somebody's starting to play around on the internet, and you can get these drugs in other places, and then you can screw up all by yourself. That's why you have vets. Barbiturates, there have been problems. Ketamine, xylazine, there's been some issues with those over the years. Halothane was the first good inhalation anesthetic we had. It was great for the animals. It started coming out of favor for two reasons. A, it actually has got an awful lot of xenobiotic conversion in humans. About 30% of it can get converted, even though it's a gaseous drug in the liver. The conversion was into something that basically created what we call a hapten, which meant that it could bind to other proteins and be used to make an anaphylactic reaction. And as a result, the first time was fine, and the second time was probably okay. Some people started having reactions to halothane. The kiss of death with this was the epidemiological study that showed anesthesiologists were showing a much higher level of leukemia if they were using halothane. Okay. So then we started switching to things like isoflurane and sevoflurane, neither of which have incredible amounts of hepatoconversion, and they've basically been the drugs that people have been using since. Bunnies like to hold their breath under these, by the way. So there's almost always, when you're having a vet, will probably be using a sedation, a mask, something else to get under. It takes a little bit of effort to use these, but they work so much better than anything else before then that there's no going back. Analgesics. We've got the opioids. We've got a couple that are regularly used. The concentrations that are used are interesting to me because they tend to be higher than the concentrations used in humans. There is a big tendency sometimes because it's not always easy to determine analgesia in an animal to go to almost something that can approach to a little bit of sleepiness, which means that you've really got a good concentration in there. NSAIDs, these are the non-steroidal anti-inflammatories. We've got piles of them out there. Aspirin is still used. Banamine is something was used for a while. Meloxicam, okay guys, how many people are using meloxicam? You bet. That one's a very good one. It's a COX-2 inhibitor, which means it's not a COX-1. COX-1 is part of, gives you the ulcer effects. COX-2s are what you're seeing now. Aspirin is both, which is why you get ulcers. Now, I say not acetaminophen. Why? I have no clue. Cats, acetaminophen. Cats are strange. Cats are from Mars. Cats have almost the right xenobiotic metabolism for acetaminophen. They go halfway through it and stop. Unfortunately, that is an incredibly toxic material that it goes halfway through to make, and it basically is why when you give it to a cat, it dies of liver failure several weeks later. Okay? I don't know why the rabbit is off this list. I will tell you why I don't put this on the list for rabbits. Flentke, who made those lists, is British. They love acetaminophen. I don't know what the problem is, except that's a culture that would choose that drug first, and it's a big hole in the experimental animal protocols. So I'm going to leave it just like that. I don't know why, but it's that way. One of the things that has been discovered over the years, particularly when working with arthritis in rabbits, was the combination of steroids and the non-steroidal anti-inflammatories gave you large problems. I suspect it's because the rabbit's immunosuppressive system usually is pretty problematic to begin with. The steroids are basically pushing it further down. The vets were always telling me the same thing. If we put them on these things, we get massive infections. So that combination in rabbits for analgesia, which is common in dogs, common in people, combined steroids, non-steroidal anti-inflammatories for arthritis. Don't use it in rabbits. Questions? I'm fairly stupid, I try. I'm on the HRS ed list. I think you all know that. Yeah?
I read a breeder who swore by phenylbutazone for his rabbits. And I know it's fallen under favor of horses. And I'm wondering if it caused or ever was in some rabbits.
Yes.
Okay. And is it effective?
Yes, it's effective.
Okay.
I think the problem with them and for Banamine has always been the question of ulcers. Thank you. And when it came to ulcers in rabbits, they seem to be a lot less affected by it. My favorite version of this is back on the old pharmacopoeia list, which is why I don't sit back here and give them. I have seen aspirin listed as 100 mg per kilogram. That's insane. That to me means that their ulcer situation, which would be at that dose, what I'd expect to see, is much lower in rabbits. Also, when they were using it in horses, they tended to give it in granules. In rabbits, we tend to give it with an injection. And I have a sneaking suspicion one of the issues may be formulation. Again, this is all conjecture. This is a problem with veterinary medicine. No disrespect to anybody, but the information out there is piecemeal at best. And sometimes what works and what doesn't work is not easy to put together. And you're just kind of going, okay, I don't know. Species is such a big deal.
I'm a vet, and I'm here because I know nothing about rabbits, and I would like to. My question for you was with Baytril when you were talking about it, and when we.
Okay,
when
I'm going to stop right now.
Pardon?
Somebody, I can't hear you at all.
Oh, okay. I just was going to ask you about Baytril. When you were talking about Baytril before for rabbits, and when we got the Baytril at first, and we started giving it to dogs, we found the cartilage problem, but then we realized in my clinical experience, it was just with puppies under a certain age.
Yes.
Is that true of rabbits?
Yes, it is. What we know in rabbits in the cartilage damage is from a completely different but related drug to the fluoroquinolones. We know that it's going to have cartilage damage. It is only in growing cartilage. So if you have a rapidly growing animal at X period of time, you will get divots in the cartilage from that. It stops the growth. So I'm quite confident that it exists in growing rabbits. I'm more worried about it in baby bunnies, and I'm not worried about it in adults. And the dose in the Beagle study was 25 to 35 mg per kg. And again, that's plenty. But again, now we're sitting back here playing the species game. And people have been using it in rabbits at 20 mg per kg on a regular basis. And I've heard that being used in baby bunnies without any, quote, noticeable effect. But I don't know, and I don't know if they were lucky.
I just had a quick comment about acetaminophen, and because it really isn't a non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drug, and knowing that now we know the first few days of bone healing with a fracture, that it's a non-steroidal anti-inflammatory is not good. Acetaminophen is starting to come back, and there's an injectable form now. So there are little pockets where it looks to me like it's going to be a very good choice for some circumstances, and
group of people that would use it that basically did not have it on their protocols, and 1 or 2 times it's like, oh, you don't do that, and that's all I know.
One of the reasons was logistics. It was had to go oral, and putting it in the water bottle and making it every day, it was just not practical.
Okay.
And now that there's the injectable, we are using it.
Okay.
This is another dose question regarding Medicham. For the longest time, we were told the dose was 0.1 to 0.3 mg per kg once every 24 hours. And I just went to an NADC, and everybody was using the new dose, 1 mg per kg, 10 order of magnitude bigger. And I tried it, and I had never noticed any analgesic effects at the lower dose, but suddenly with the 1 mg per kg, it's great.
This is where I sit back here and I go, you know, the dosage on that particular thing was based on dogs. Dogs are, okay, people, I'm in a very different, a problem here. I am in the pharmaceutical industry, so to speak. We do animal testing. And when we come to do animal testing, and the dog throws up, we ignore it. Because dogs do that. They get ulcers. They don't make those are side effects that we don't look at in dogs as a species in evaluating human drugs because they're too sensitive to it. In all of the non-steroidal anti-inflammatories, dogs have bad effects first. All of the acetaminophen data came from dogs. So my guess is, as people are getting away from dog as a model for the drug, which is what it's FDA approved for the most part, they're finding out that you've got a lot more flexibility. Also, no matter what they said about COX-1 versus COX-2, they've treated all of the NSAIDs like they were broad-spectrum inhibitors that still could cause ulcers. So we're probably going to find over the next 5 or 10 years that some of these COX-2 inhibitors are really not anywhere near as big of a problem, but they are treating them with very much fragile hands-off on this issue, even though that's what the pharmaceutical industry was hoping for those drugs. So I'm not surprised. I really do anticipate watching that number creep up some more.
George, in using the Medicham on the babies, what age range are we talking about?
Medicham or Vatril?
I'm sorry, Vatril.
Okay, thanks. I thought that's what you meant, Nick.
Yeah.
We're talking about rapidly growing bunnies, but we're really talking about, let's say, 0 to about 4 or 5 weeks old.
Okay.
Very early, that's where they're really growing fast.
Yeah.
But the reality is, you know, we only have limited information on that. The information we've got is on a drug that basically never made it to market because it's highly mammalian toxic. Vatril was the industry's ability to get rid of some of those problems. And I don't know if there's anything tied between or what causes the cartilage damage, so to speak, to let us know whether or not Vatril should have more or less, depending on what you're working with. We can only go on what we got, which is OB data. Go ahead.
About the overuse causing increase in MRSA infections, or
Can you repeat the question? Repeat the question.
No, so we can hear.
The question is whether Vatril overuse may be contributing to MRSA in the rabbit population.
Okay. First and foremost, MRSA is a very specific statement. Vatril, Vatril is not usually in that definition for MRSA. MRSA is another series of antibiotic resistances. But yeah, it's there. Europeans don't use any antibiotics in chicken industry. The antibiotics that were used in Vatril in the United States in chicken caused a change in the somatic mutation from a level of about 0.01 to 0.3. We're looking at what I would call the beginning of an exponential curve, at which point it was dropped out of the chicken industry for feed. It still can be used as an injectable on individual birds, but you're now out of sitting back here and getting into that. Hopefully that will keep us from getting into serious trouble with that. But MRSA is actually a slightly different start with something, and I will deal with culture and sensitivity because without it, you've got nothing at all. And you're
Can it be misleading?
Well, I think it can be, but I've had so many times where basically I started with that and it worked, and I can't believe that if I was going for random sampling, it's that. The other thing to recognize with culture and sensitivity is it doesn't always identify the bacteria, which is nice because I'm not interested in the bacteria, I'm interested in killing what's there. And if the bacteria that I've got there is sensitive to an antibiotic, it's still my best bet. And yeah, it's an expensive thing, but it's the only, but it's the only time you can, it's the only information you've got. I think we're done with questions because I've been nailed by more people than not to shut up.